Hey everyone, welcome back to Audio Terra Labs. Today I'm going to walk you through some of the plugins I use and how I mix an orchestral trailer track. We'll go through every group of instruments of this mix. The keys, the strings, the brass, the drones, the risers, whooshes, pulses, impacts, drums, and percussion. And I'll explain not just what I do, but why I make each decision so the mix sounds clear and dynamic and cinematic. But before we get started, let me play a section of this track so you can hear what we are mixing today. Alright, so let's get started with the keys. In this track, I have 8 different keys, each playing a distinct and critical role. First, though, I do want to mention one important thing, which is I tend to turn the gain up or down as opposed to the conventional way some other engineers approach this, which is by lowering the fader instead. Don't get me wrong, I do adjust the fader sometimes, but that's only after I adjust the track's gain stage. So I want to start with this first piano. For this saturation plugin, I use the E style on this track to brighten the keys up and add harmonic richness while pushing up the drive knob. I also brought up the bell shape at around 788 Hz. Typically, I don't always do that to keys to that extreme, but when looking at the big picture of the entire piano section, it sounded good. I also cut a lot of that unwanted low end, which I usually cut around 100 to 200 Hz. This removes unnecessary rumble and it prevents the keys from clashing with other instruments. So for this next piano track, I also brought in an EQ, which I dipped a narrow band around 805 Hz by -60 dB and removed a lot of that low end by doing so to reduce some of that boxiness as well. And then I boosted around 1K with a +3 dB to bring out that upper mid. This helps the keys sit forward in the mix without being too harsh. I also added some saturation and pushed the brightness knob up just a tad. And as you can tell so far, I really like to use the E style setting in Decapitator. And then I added another EQ, and for this EQ I sidechained it to another synth piano at around 171 Hz and a 444 Hz. This makes sure this piano can shine when both keys are being played together. Then after that, I also added another sidechain, but I used a compressor using the same synth key, but I used it to slightly duck it, keeping the layers balanced. For all the other keys, I just rolled off a lot of the low end to make space for strings, pads, downers, and impacts, and of course hits. Now for the key summoning stack, I used Decapitator to enhance the mids and harmonics. I used Fresh Air by Waves to lift the upper mid frequencies. I threw an EQ to cut off that unwanted low end. And then I added a vintage VCA compressor to glue everything together. And then lastly, I used an adaptive limiter to control the output ceiling and avoid clipping. This approach ensures all keys work together, each in its own frequency space without masking one another. Let's go ahead and take a listen just to the key section. And if you paid attention, you can hear a little bit of distortion. That's from the decapitator. I really love how that came out. Once the whole track is played, you really can't hear the distortion, but it brings the character out. So that's why I kept it in there. I also want to mention that I did bust the keys to a reverb called Valhalla Room. I kept the decay at 2.9 and the depth all the way up to 100. And I used this preset called Abbey Church. I hope I'm saying this right. Abbey Church of Bossa Nova. Right after that, I added an EQ to remove some of those low end and higher frequency reverb tails. And lastly, I threw in an adaptive limiter at the end of the chain. I turned on remove DC offset and I turned on true peak detection. And I kept the out ceiling at minus 0.1. Next, the strings. Strings are very essential for trailer and cinematic emotion, so clarity is very key. So I'm going to show a few of these string ensemble patches and what I did with them and the plugins that I added so you can have a better understanding of why they sound the way they do. So let's start with the bass ensemble. For the bass ensemble, I start with OTD for both upward and downward compression. This balances the dynamics, allowing soft and loud passages so it sits evenly in the mix. At least to my ears, this is what it does for me. Next, I added an EQ with a low and high cut, rolling off that unnecessary low end and high end frequencies to create space for other instruments, especially in higher registers. For the light full string ensemble, which just includes the violins and violas, I repeated the similar process I did with the keys by using OTT and EQ to cut and carve out space, especially the low end and the high end. This also applies to cellos when they're being played rapidly in passages, which is included in this track. So here's the EQ where I cut the low end at about 140 Hertz and the higher end at about 7200 Hertz. For this track, for the viola staccatissimo, I again added OTT for the upward and downward compression, followed by an EQ to cut some of that low and high end of the spectrum. And if you notice, I actually added decapitator at the end of this chain with no EQ after that. I liked how the low end of that saturation plugin brought it out, so I left it alone. Like I say, if it's not broken, why fix it, right? So here's the OTT. Here's the EQ where I cut that lower end at about 115 Hertz. I dipped down at 266 Hertz, and then I cut some of that 4600 Hertz. And basically, I pretty much did the same thing with the remaining strings, like adding saturation, carving out certain parts of frequencies with an EQ, and with the strings using EQ and sidechain compression again, making room for newer instruments, newer elements being introduced in the act as the track progresses. Again, I wanted to mention that I did bust the strings as well to a reverb using Valhalla Room with a little bit of different settings. For the strings, I kept the decay at 3.10, the high cut at 6500 Hertz, and the depth at 90.3%. And I used the same preset as I did with the keys. And again, right after the Valhalla Room, I cut off the low end and the high end reverb tails. And then I also decided to throw in an adaptive limiter. I didn't mess with the gain. I did turn on the remove DC offset, and I also turned on the true peak detection, and I kept the out ceiling at minus 0.1. So again, for the string summoning stack, I added saturation for brightness and harmonic enhancement. I added EQ to tame that low end buildup caused by the saturation. I added a soft clipper to tame and run off those high peaks. And then again, I used Logic's vintage VCA glue compressor to make all the strings cohesive. Then at the end of the chain, I added an adaptive limiter for ceiling control and the DC offset removal turned to on, as well as the true peak detection turned to on. And I also kept the out ceiling at minus 0.1. This plug-in chain in the string summoning stack, make sure the strings are bright, clear, and sit perfectly in the mid and upper frequency spectrum without overpowering other elements. Let's go ahead and take a listen to just the string section alone so you can hear what these plugins does when they're applied to the summoning stack. Alright, now for the brass section. For the French horns, I did a low cut at 123 Hertz and I dipped around 200 Hertz and 420 Hertz by minus 3 dB just to remove some of that muddiness. As you can see right here, this is where I did my dips and this is where I cut my low end. And then I wanted to add some more saturation, so I brought up Decapitator so I can bring up the brightness, and I pushed up the drive knob slightly more than usual to about 4, as you can see right here. I still kept it at E style. I pushed up the brightness tone knob just a bit. Now for the low brass, I added another saturation plugin, again using Decapitator, but this time I dialed down the tone just to make it a little bit darker while pushing the drive up just a bit. As you can see right here, I brought down the tone down just to make it a little darker. I pushed up the drive close to 2, and then I just left the rest alone. I also brought out my Fat Filter Pro Q3, and I ended up rolling out about 209 hertz of that unwanted low end to make room for my hits and my pulses and drums. And then I just dipped down the frequency around 435 hertz just to carve out some of that space. It's important to listen to each group of instruments while doing all these adjustments so you know what you need to carve out or add a certain plugin to bring out a certain instrument you want to be more prominent in the mix. And then for the brass summoning stack, I added some OTT, slightly lowering down the downward compression while increasing the upward compression and keeping the depth about 32%. And yep, you guessed it, I added another EQ to roll off those unwanted low-end frequencies that are added by our good old Decapitator. And I also rolled off some of that high-end frequency at about 1300 hertz. Then I added again another glue compressor using the vintage VCA. And then lastly, I added an adaptive limiter for controlling the output ceiling. I pushed up the gain about 3 dB. I turned on remove DC offset, and I also turned on true peak detection. These plugins in the summoning stack for the brass section really does help make the brass sound powerful, punchy, and well integrated with the rest of the orchestral elements. Let's go ahead and take a listen to the brass section only. And I do want to mention as well, I busted to another Valhalla room using the same preset, using the decay at 2.90 seconds, the depth all the way to 100%, and I kept everything else the same. And I also threw another Fat Filter Pro EQ to remove some of that unwanted reverb tail on the low end and high end of the frequency spectrum. And then lastly, another adaptive limiter just to control the out ceiling at minus 0.01. So now let's move on to the drones. Obviously, drones and atmospheres help provide the backbone of the entire track, right? It sets the tone, it carries it by supporting all the instruments when done right, obviously. So I know by looking at my screen, you can see that I have a lot of drones, right? I have about 10 drones. So it might seem like overkill, but I did this because it works sonically for this track. So let me show you a few examples of what I did with these drones. So basically for all these drones, I added some Decapitator for subtle saturation and used an EQ to roll off some of that low end right after the saturation plugin, because like I said earlier, that Decapitator loves to add that low end, which you definitely want to add an EQ right after the Decapitator to roll off that low end. Unless it sounds good to you and to your ears, you know, it depends on the project and the source, right? So for this drone track, you can tell I added a Decapitator using the E style. I pushed up the tone up a little bit to give it some brightness and a little bit of drive, and I left everything else alone. And then right after the Decapitator, I removed the low end to about 100 hertz, found a sweet spot, so I just left it there. And then I dipped around that muddiness at around 174 hertz at minus 3 dB. I also added some compression to tame some of those drones slash pads just a bit. I sidechained some of these drones to others to make space for them because I preferred for some other drones to stick out a bit more than others due to its characteristics. Again, this was just a personal choice. And like I mentioned earlier, I basically just brought out an EQ and removed a lot of that unwanted low end and some of the muddiness because I wanted to make room for the drums and the hits and the pulses. Now for the drone summoning stack, I just added an OTT, an EQ to tame that low end. I used the compression, the vintage VCA to glue all the drones together so they sound cohesive. And then I added an adaptive limiter to raise the gain just a bit and to turn on the DC offset and also turn on the true peak detection and have that out ceiling at minus 0.1 dB. For the drone summoning chain rack, this ensures the drones are present but not overpowering, blending smoothly with the keys, the brass, the bass, and the rest of the instruments. Let's take a quick listen to the drone section with all these plugins in the summoning stack. So for the risers, I just adjusted the gain to taste, and I rolled out the low end to about 100 hertz. Just like you can see right here, I just rolled off the low end for the risers. I also bust the risers to a reverb using Valhalla Room, keeping the decay at 2 seconds, the depth at 50, and the rest at default. And of course, I added a low cut to remove some of that unwanted reverb tail, and I just removed a bit of that high-end reverb. For the whooshes, I did the same treatment as I did for the risers. I did a low-end cut to around 100 hertz, and then subtle reverb for smooth transition. The reverb for these whooshes keeps the transitions clean and allows other instruments to shine without muddiness, especially when applying the EQ. For the riser summoning stack, I basically just added an adaptive limiter, raised the gain to about 1.3 dB and the out ceiling to 0.1. And of course, I turned on the remove DC offset, turned on the true peak detection, and I raised the gain up about to 1.3 dBs. And for the whooshes summoning stack, I just added again an adaptive limiter to which I pushed the gain up a bit, set the out ceiling to minus 0.1, and turned on the DC offset and true peak detection. Let's go ahead and take a listen to a small section of the risers and whooshes combined together. And then let me play this one here at the end. And now for the pulses. I have 4 pulses playing through the entire track, but each of them play a critical role. For some of these pulses, I added a decapitator for saturation to brighten up or to darken the tone depending on the sample and what I was going for. One of these pulses, I used an EQ to remove low frequencies. And as you can see, I went pretty extreme with removing a lot of the low end and mid-low to make room for my hits and my drums. Like I said, if it sounds good and it does the job, I'm happy with it, even if it goes against some of the basic EQ theory fundamentals. For the rest of the pulses, I added some minor EQ, removing low end, some of that harshness, boxiness, and I added some adaptive limiter with true peak detection on and with an out ceiling of minus 1 dB. On one of the pulses, I even gave it some width along with some decapitator and EQ to remove that low end that we talked about earlier. I loved how it sounded, so I just kept it that way. So for the pulses summoning track, I added an EQ to remove some low end and a bit of some harshness in the 4K area, then a vintage VCA compressor with a fast attack and fast release to glue things together. Let's go ahead and just take a listen to the pulses so you can hear what it sounds like. Okay, now for the impacts and hits. In my opinion, they sounded really great out of the box. I use Ferrum by Keith Forrest, and it's a must-have in my opinion for someone that needs to create some epic trailer and cinematic music. But anyway, I didn't have to do too much processing to these impacts and hits. All I added was some saturation using decapitator, pushing up some of the brightness, leaving the drive alone. Then I removed some low end at around 39 hertz. I pushed up a bell shape at around 70 hertz with a plus 2 dB and cut out a lot of the high end up to 1K using a slope of 6 dB. This ensures your hits cut through the mix and remain prominent without masking too much of the other elements. For the hit summoning stack, all I really needed to do was add a compressor to tame the impacts and hits to make them cohesive. And of course, I added another adaptive limiter just to push up the gain a bit and control the out ceiling at minus 0.1 dB. Let's take a listen to the hits and impacts section alone. By the way, I did join the hits and impacts together, so they're both one sample. That's why you don't see one sample label impact and one sample label hit. They're both joined together. Let's go ahead and take a listen. So for drums, I started with cymbals. I didn't have too much processing here, minus the exception of just rolling off a bit of low end muddiness and cutting down a little bit of that 4K harshness and adding some fresh air. So here's the fresh air. I just brought it up to 15%. And here's my EQ. I cut some low end, some of that boxiness, and then some of that harshness around 4K. For the taikos, the tipping rolls, and the taiko roll crescendo, I just EQ'd out some unwanted low end and added a bit of saturation. So as you can see, I just rolled off the low end, and for this last crescendo, I just added some decapitator just to bring out some brightness and a little bit of drive. Now for the meat and potatoes, which for me are the drums. I added some decapitator, keeping it in E style, bringing up the tone knob a little bit just to make it brighter, and then just bringing up the drive knob just a bit and leaving the rest as default. Then I added some R bass, keeping the intensity at 0.0, the frequency at 80 Hz, and the output at default. Then I followed that by rolling off some low end at around 50 Hz. And then of course some adaptive limiter. I brought up the gain to 3 dB. I turned on remove DC offset. I turned on true peak detection. And I put the out ceiling at minus 0.1 dB. And then I layered more drums on top of that. With this track, I added some more decapitator. Again, using the E style, bringing up the bright knob a little bit. And then bringing up the drive a little bit more than the other one, close to 1.5. And then the rest I left at default. Of course, I brought in the EQ, remove some of that low end and some of that boxiness. And then I bust this track to another Valhalla, keeping the decay at 3.10, the high cut at 6500 Hz, and the depth at 90.3%, and the rest at default. I also layered the drums with percussion stick patterns, which I added with some saturation using decapitator, Fresh Air by Slate Digital, and some EQ to roll out that unwanted low end and also tame some of that higher frequency. And of course I bust that percussion to another Valhalla reverb channel. And now for the drum summoning stack, I used an EQ to roll out some of that low end at 62 Hz using a minus 18 dB slope and remove some muddiness around 120 Hz at minus 3 dB. Then I threw in some saturation by decapitator to give it a bit more brightness to the tone. I then used a glue compressor, again using Logic's vintage VCA with a fast attack at 7.5 milliseconds and a release at 61.0 milliseconds. And last but not least, I added another adaptive limiter with turning on the remove DC offset, turning on true peak detection, and keeping the out ceiling at minus 0.1. Using this chain rack helped keep the rhythm for the drums and the percussion section really tight, punchy, and present without overpowering all the other orchestral elements. Let's go ahead and take a listen to the percussion and drum section. And that's pretty much my basic workflow for mixing orchestral trailer tracks. I don't want to say that each track is different and the techniques and plugins I use today might not necessarily be applicable to every track that needs mixing. That being said, for this track we just went through, each section like the keys, the brass, the drones, the risers, the percussion, the hits, they all have their own space and role to play in the mix. By carefully EQing, compressing, saturating, and limiting each layer, you create a balanced cinematic sound that hits hard while remaining clear and dynamic. Just remember, small, deliberate adjustments make all the difference. Most of the time, you really don't have to go crazy, especially if your libraries sound amazing right out of the box. Thoughtful mixing ensures everything fits together perfectly when thinking about the bigger picture. If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and hit that bell for more cinematic, mixing, and trailer tutorials. And if you want to know how I master these trailer tracks, please let me know down in the section below. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.